What'd your parents do when you were a kid?
My parents, my dad was a businessman and had a bunch of shops in the centre of Manchester selling all sorts of stuff, from musical instruments to records to tape recorders to radios, cameras, all that kind of stuff, and camping equipment for some bizarre reason. And my mum was just my mum.
She was a stay-at-home mom.
Yeah.
Now, so were you ever interested in going into? Obviously, you said he's selling all this musical equipment and and camping equipment as well. But specifically, did you want to go into being just like a traditional businessman at any point?
Absolutely not.
That was never an interest.
Well, no, not remotely. I mean, it was my dad's interest. He wanted me to be, and indeed, I used to sort of help out in different shops on Saturday occasionally. But I fucking hated it. I did not like doing that. But it recently occurred to me that I ended up being in all those businesses anyway, somehow. Cameras, radios, tape recorders, musical instruments, which is kind of very bizarre.
So did
But no, I didn't want to be a businessman. I wanted to be an artist.
with all that equipment, did you have the opportunity as a kid? Like, was there stuff around the house that maybe like leftover stuff from what he was selling that you got to play around with?
Not around the house. No, there was a basement at the music shop, which I used to sort of dive into every now and again, and found all manner of bizarre bits of instrumentation down there. And the first drum kit I ever owned was sort of cobbled together from bits of other drum kits that I hadn't sold in the shop. And I had, like a sort of red side tom tom and a pearl snare and a different cymbal here and a cymbal, all from different bits, sort of a hybrid kit, which sounded like shit, but was wonderful briefly.
And were your parents okay with you? I mean, because a lot of parents don't want their kids to pick up any instrument. Nevertheless, picking up the drums, and I'm a drummer myself, so I know that from personal experience. My parents are very supportive, but you know how it is. Were they okay with it?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really practice at home. I didn't really get into it until I was able to join a band, and then it became a little more serious. So I never actually practiced at home with anything other than practice pads or a cymbal and a snare.
Was that
So I didn't actually deafen anybody at home.
was that first band? Was that Group 17, or is that before that?
No, I think it was Group 17. I have no idea why it was called Group 17 because none of us were 17. We're probably more like 15. So some weird code or something. I can't remember.
There wasn't 17 of you either.
No, there wasn't 17 of us. No, I think there were 3 or 4 of us, and we were terrible. And I was originally the bass player, actually, but I couldn't play bass to save my life and graduated to drums so I could sit at the back and hammer things. It was much more satisfying, I found.
Was there anything else besides music once you got into drums and you said you were kind of, plucking on the bass? Were you interested in anything else? Was there any like, oh, this is, if, I'm into drumming, but I actually have this other hobby that I'm really good at. Was there anything like that? Or is it really just music at that point?
Well, I was a kid, I think kids back then, we're talking like late 1950s, early 1960s. Like most kids of my age, we were looking for a way out that wasn't what we were expected to do,
Mm-hmm.
if you know what I mean. I mean, you mentioned, did I want to go into the family business? No, I didn't, but my father anticipated me wanting to. But the only other thing that I could do well was draw. I could draw things and spend a lot of time drawing. So I was artistically inclined. So on the one hand, I was a fledgling musician and songwriter. All the writing came later. On the other hand, I was drawing stuff. And I guess there was something inside me that was looking for a way to combine the two things because they were the only things that I could do. Life, I couldn't handle. Life was boring.
What do you mean by that?
Well, because back then, until maybe 63, 64, 65, if you were a preteen, there was no teenagers weren't really catered for if you know what I mean. We were sort of the invisibles. And we didn't really mean anything until we became adults, and we were expected to be like our parents were to a degree. It was the beginning of the youth revolution, which I think probably began in your country more than mine. But it's like nobody knew not only what we were, but what we were supposed to be.
Were you a
You know,
rebellious teen?
was I what?
Were you like particularly rebellious as a teenager?
No, I was pretty quiet. I was inwardly rebellious. I was always looking for things to do artistically, but no, I wasn't physically rebellious particularly. Although one fell into a way of life. What It's a funny thing when you're young, you want to be part of a group. I think you're not really looking for your own individuality. You need to associate with something that's going on in the world. And so I ended up going to art college, more than one art college, which kept me out of trouble for a while. But I I got to talking to a bunch of people and working with a bunch of people and began to learn that things were changing around the world, and I identified with that. You
How
know, we're
when you
talking like the beat generation, for want of a better description of what was going on.
and were you do you consider yourself, you were artsy? Were you the kind of artsy where it was like, oh, he's so cool, he's into all of these things, or was it more kind of like that nerdy type of artsy as a kid, where you are, like you said, you are reserved, but there's a lot of people who they kind of use that in a way that it's hip, especially nowadays. Being that nerdy artsy kind of kid is cool. Back then, did you feel that
Well,
kind of way, like I'm unique?
I don't know. I was probably the guy that sat on the stairs, tapping the stairs as a drummer, as opposed to dancing at house parties. So I don't know whether I qualified for either of those. I was shy. Um, I, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up, other than I didn't really want to grow up. And I didn't want to grow up and become what I was expected to be. I knew that my future lay in some form of art. Uh, so my parents suggested that I go to art college, but specifically to learn graphic design so that I could become a commercial artist, because that sounded like a proper job. Yeah, a graphic designer essentially, which is what I did. I went to a few art colleges. But by then, I'd already sort of palled up with a neighbor of mine, Lol Cream, who was of a similar frame of mind, and we both ended up at two different art colleges, and we began to enjoy the student life.
How'd you
You
feel
know,
about your parents suggesting going to graphic arts school? Was it on your end, were you like, oh, this makes sense, I'm artsy, this is perfect? Or did you kind of feel like they were pushing you towards something that you
no,
weren't really into?
no, I was thinking brilliant. I was thinking brilliant because I kind of knew that going to I knew that going to art college would be a good place to learn to become myself, and that was an instinct that was actually correct, because at the time things were happening at art college all over the place. It was quite a revolutionary place to be, regardless of which college you were at. There were all sorts of social changes going on at the time, and one became part of that, and you grew as a person into that, I think, and you began to understand what was possible.
How were you supporting yourself when you first went to college? Were you just, were your
I
parents
had a
helping you
grant.
completely, or did you have any side jobs?
No, I had a grant. I mean, most students at that time had what's known as a grant. If you ended up being chosen to go to a particular college, you were given a small amount of money to live on, to pay your rent and to eat, which are the two
That's an
basic
important
things
one.
you kind of need. Yeah, I probably got a little bit of pocket money from my parents, but not much. So I was like any normal student, really.
were
I
you
just got lost in the life.
were you hyper devoted to your classes when you were in college, or were you kind
No,
of
I
just
was awful.
really?
I was shit.
So you were
You
basically, you
know,
were doing what
I
you wanted to do, and the classes all came separate.
no, I I did what I was supposed to do and nothing more, because I found after a while you can't really teach art. Particularly during the formative years, you do lots of different kinds of art. You do sculpture, you do painting, and you learn the history of art. And they also give you projects to do, like design a book jacket for this book, design some branding, a logo for this particular product, and you do it. You don't know whether it's any good or not. But when you come out the other end, they haven't really taught you to find your own style. They've produced somebody who has the basics to exist in that particular profession, if you like. And I left with a degree, graduated with a degree, which has been completely useless to me.
So then what?
Because
Keep going.
Sorry, on the day I left college, Lol Cream and I drove to London for a recording session. And I know I was at this particular college for a 3-year course.
So you were working,
which I passed.
Were you in bands as soon as you got to college, or was there kind of a period of time where you were just focusing on art specifically in the traditional sense?
No, I was doing the two at the same time, and being in a band. I think the band was called. Initially, it was called Sabres, and then I joined another band called the Mockingbirds. Mm-hmm. And in the Mockingbirds, I was touring in a very shabby way. I'd do a day at the art college. I'd get picked up in a van, and we'd shoot off around England and do a gig. And I'd come back to my shabby little shack, wake up in the morning and go to college. It was like that maybe 2 or 3 times a week. So, and playing drums in a band and traveling around the UK in the back of a band was much more exciting than graphic design. As you can imagine.
So you actually...
We were only playing at clubs, little clubs, but it was great.
But you were preferring over the comfy traditional sense of I'm going to learn this and, have a career in it. You were enjoying the kind of shabby cheapness, but it was the excitement is what you really enjoyed. You didn't care about the fact you weren't sitting there at the gigs going like, damn, it's 1 a.m. and I'm not getting any money. You weren't thinking about that. You were just enjoying it so much in the moment that it outweighed everything else.
Absolutely. I was maybe probably about 17, 18, something. So my whole life was in front of me. But things were happening. A couple of things were enjoyable on different levels. Mm-hmm. But, playing in front of a sweaty audience in a tiny club for an hour and a half, hammering away on a kit at the back in a rhythm and blues band was way more enticing than sitting at a desk designing a book jacket.
That's
where someone
true.
would come along and say, well, that's not too bad, Kevin. It'd be a little better if you tweaked it and added a little more red where you've got blue. It's not as exciting as